I watched the coffin sink slowly into the earth, and my body refused to feel anything. Around me, people wept, some quietly, with polite little gasps behind lace handkerchiefs, others loudly, as if their grief needed to be seen to be real. My mother stood beside me, stiff as stone, her face carefully composed, her mouth set in the same tight line I remembered from childhood. She hadn't cried. She wouldn't. That was her gift, the ability to swallow emotion whole and never let it show. She taught me well. I should have cried. I wanted to. My grandmother had been everything to me at one point. Caregiver, storyteller, the one person who kept the house from falling into silence. But standing there, under that pale sky, all I could feel was distance. A yawning, silent space between me and everyone else, as if grief required a password I had forgotten. She was the woman who taught me to hold chopsticks properly, who brewed barley tea and left it to cool by the window in summer. She rarely hugged me. She rarely smiled. But there was something in the way she tucked the blanket under my chin at night that made me believe I was safe. And now she was gone, swallowed by dirt and ritual. The priest spoke in a low, rhythmic voice, but I didn't hear the words. My eyes were fixed on the coffin, on the smooth, lacquered wood, on the white lilies trembling in the breeze. My hands were cold. The world felt muted. I was surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. They said her soul had moved on, but mine stayed exactly where it was, suspended between the living and the dead, waiting for something to break. I returned to her house alone. The others, my cousins, uncles, aunts, left quickly after the ceremony, offering shallow condolences and tired promises to stay in touch. They had their lives elsewhere, apartments in Osaka, jobs in Tokyo, children who barely knew Aya's name. No one wanted to stay in that house longer than they had to. But I did. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe obligation. Or maybe I needed answers I couldn't name yet. The house greeted me like a breath held too long. It hadn't changed in decades. The same faded wallpaper curling at the corners, the same narrow hallway that creaked under every footstep. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of old tatami, soy sauce, and something faintly sweet. Dried persimmons, maybe. And underneath it all, a smell I couldn't place. Dust, memory, and something like sadness. In the kitchen, her kettle still sat on the stove, half full. Her slippers were neatly aligned at the door, untouched. A rice cracker lay uneaten in a small dish beside her armchair, as if time had simply paused the moment she died. I wandered room to room, not knowing what I was looking for. I found photo albums, old sewing supplies, a stack of letters in a drawer, none addressed to me. I ran my fingers over the fabric of her winter coat still hanging in the closet, worn thin at the cuffs. Everything was in its place. Everything but her. That night, I slept in the guest room, curled under a quilt that still smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. The silence was not peaceful. It was the kind that pressed against your chest, the kind that listened back. I didn't sleep well. Dreams came in fragments. A little girl crying in the hallway, a door that wouldn't close, my mother's voice calling a name I didn't recognize. In the dark, I felt the house watching me, not with malice, with memory. I found the box the next morning. It was raining lightly, the kind of soft, persistent drizzle that made everything feel further away. I went into the basement, looking for storage crates. Practical things, empty boxes, old suitcases. I wasn't expecting to find anything important. Certainly not something that would change everything. The basement was cold, musty. It always had been. I remember playing there as a child, building castles out of cardboard and pretending I was someone braver than I was. Now it felt smaller, claustrophobic. The air was thick with damp wood and old paper. Behind a row of futons and stacked crates, I noticed a cloth-covered bundle shoved deep in the back of the closet. I pulled it out, sneezing at the dust cloud that followed. Beneath the cloth was a wooden box, simple, undecorated, tied with a thin white ribbon that had yellowed with age. My fingers hesitated at first. There was something sacred about it, like opening it would disturb not just her secrets, but something older, quieter. Inside were letters, dozens of them, folded carefully, tied in bundles with string. Some were stained, others crisp and neat. Most were addressed in my grandmother's handwriting. To old friends, distant family members, names I barely recognized. One bundle was marked to be burned. I set that aside. And then I saw it. A single envelope, flat and thin, buried at the bottom. My name was written on the front, Naomi, in that sharp, deliberate script I knew so well. No address, no stamp, just my name. I sat on the floor, holding it in both hands. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I stared at the letters on the page like they might rearrange themselves. The house above me groaned softly. The storm outside was picking up. And inside me, something cracked. A door, maybe. Or a silence I didn't know I had been keeping. This letter had waited for me. For this moment. For this version of myself. I wasn't ready. But I opened it anyway. Her handwriting hadn't changed. It was the same careful brush of ink I remembered from the birthday cards she used to leave by my futon when I was a child. The same angular precision, the same unspoken discipline between the strokes. But this wasn't a birthday card. This was something else entirely. To Naomi, when I am no longer here. That was the only line on the outside. Inside, the paper had yellowed slightly, but the words were clear. No introduction, no apology. Just truth, or at least her version of it, laid bare in black ink. I read it once in silence. Then again, slower. By the third time, my hands were trembling. She wrote about my mother. She wrote about the man I thought was my father, and how he wasn't. She wrote about choices made in anger, in silence, in shame. About things said and unsaid. She described a night, long before I was born, when my mother came home late, crying, her blouse torn at the collar, and how no one asked questions. How silence became survival. She spoke of a pregnancy my mother denied, then accepted, then resented. Of how I was born into a house not ready to hold me. Of how my mother threatened to leave, to run away, to disappear, and how my grandmother begged her to stay, promising to raise me herself if she couldn't. There was a line I couldn't stop reading. Your mother loved you in the way she could, but she feared you more. I read that line 10, maybe 12 times. I thought I knew pain. I didn't. Not until those words settled in my throat and refused to leave. I sat there for hours, the paper folded in my lap, staring at the basement wall like it could offer some kind of explanation. Time didn't move, or maybe it broke. She had never sent the letter. I wondered why. Maybe she thought it would protect me. Maybe she ran out of time. Or maybe she couldn't bear to look me in the eye after putting all this down on paper. Some truths arrive too late, but they still cut deep. By nightfall, the storm outside had become a steady roar, wind clawing at the eaves, rain tapping the windows like fingers. I sat in the kitchen with the letter on the table, cold tea untouched beside it. I stared at the wall for what felt like hours before I reached for my phone. I dialed her number before I could change my mind. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice clipped and tired. She didn't ask how I was, just waited. "I found a letter," I said. Silence. It was from her. About you. About me. About everything. More silence. A breath, maybe. "I don't want to talk about that," she finally said, her tone flat. "The past is gone." "But it's not," I said. "It's sitting in front of me, in her handwriting. It's not gone. It was never gone." She was quiet again, and then, "She had no right." That made me pause. "No right to what?" "To judge me," she said. "To put it all on me. She always made herself the hero, the martyr. Like she saved us, when really—" She cut herself off. I waited, but the words didn't come. "She said you were afraid of me," I whispered. A beat of silence. Then, barely audible. I was. I didn't know what I expected. A confession? An apology? Some catharsis? All I felt was the cold. The wide, aching distance between two women tied by blood and severed by silence. "I needed to know," I said. "And now you do." That was the last thing she said before hanging up. The screen went dark in my hand. I sat there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the ceiling. And in that stillness, something inside me, something fragile and childlike, finally broke. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I wasn't ready to forgive her either. Some truths weren't meant to be healed. Only carried. Later that night, I opened the old family albums. Not the ones in the living room, curated for guests. I found the real ones, tucked in the back of her closet, inside a battered suitcase that smelled like cedar and thyme. Albums that hadn't been opened in years, their pages brittle, plastic sleeves yellowed and curling at the edges. Most of the photos were black and white. My grandmother as a young woman, unsmiling in every frame. My mother as a child, always looking away from the camera. I flipped page after page, searching for something I couldn't name until I found it. A photo of me, no more than 2 years old, sitting in a garden. Someone was holding me. A man. His face was cut out of the picture. Literally. The corner of the photo was missing, torn away cleanly, as if someone couldn't bear to look at him anymore. I stared at the empty space where a face should have been. My baby self sat in his lap, smiling wide, one hand grabbing at his shirt. Whoever he was, I looked happy with him. I checked the back of the photo, in faded pencil. Naomi, Summer, Tokyo. No mention of the man, no clue, just absence. I kept digging. A few pages later, I found the same photo, this time whole. His face was calm, kind, unfamiliar. He looked like me, not the man I had called Dad in childhood. That man had left when I was 6. This was someone else. Someone no one had ever spoken of. I sat on the floor with the photo in both hands, 2 versions of the same moment. One edited, one raw. It felt like a metaphor. One was the story they gave me. The other was the one they buried. I didn't know his name. I didn't know where he was now. But for the first time, I wanted to. Not to meet him. Not even to confront him. Just to understand what part of me had been missing all this time. I couldn't stop thinking about one line from the letter. It came near the end, almost as an afterthought. Just a sentence. A breath. But it hit harder than anything else she wrote. There was almost another child. I read it 10 times before it made sense. Another child. A sister. My sister. The letter didn't give details, just fragments. My mother had been pregnant again, sometime after I was born. My grandmother wrote that the pregnancy was complicated, that my mother wasn't in her right mind, that she chose not to continue. Those were her words, vague, sanitized, painful in their restraint. I sat on the bedroom floor, surrounded by papers, trying to imagine a version of my life where I wasn't alone, where there was someone else in the back seat, someone else sharing the silence, someone else to make sense of the strange, cold love that passed for affection in our family. What would she have been like? Would we have looked alike? Would she have hated the way I chewed my nails or loved the same bad detective shows? Would we have whispered in the dark about how strange Mom was? Would she have believed me when I said that sometimes I felt invisible? There's a certain kind of grief reserved for people who never existed. It's not loud. It doesn't get funerals or flowers. It just sits with you, quietly, in the spaces between questions. It changes nothing, and somehow, everything. I cried for her that night. The sister I never had. The girl who might have been my mirror, my shield, my anchor. The girl whose name I'll never know. And maybe, though I'll never be sure, the girl my mother couldn't bear to raise again. I started hearing the silence differently. It wasn't just absence anymore. It was inheritance. The way my mother looked through me instead of at me. The way my grandmother used to nod instead of speak. The way I swallowed my own feelings, wrapped them in polite smiles, tried not to need too much from anyone. That wasn't just our way. It was our legacy. The more I thought about it, the more I saw the patterns. How silence was passed down like a quilt, each woman stitching in her own pain, then folding it neatly and handing it to the next. Not out of malice, out of survival. My grandmother never talked about her husband. I barely remember a photo. He died young, they said. Or maybe he left. No one ever told me the real story. My mother never spoke of love. When I asked her once if she ever missed anyone, she blinked like I'd asked her to translate a foreign language. Miss, she repeated, that's a useless feeling. And me? I became an expert in pretending I didn't care, in laughing too loud, in being fine. It wasn't just that they lied. It was that they built whole lives on the refusal to speak. And now, here I was, holding the letter that cracked the silence open, and realizing I had no one to share it with. There was a pain in that, but also, strangely, a power. Because once you see the pattern, you can choose to break it. Even if it means starting from nothing. Even if it means sitting in the dark and whispering, I want more. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, long after the rain had stopped. The sky outside was beginning to lighten. Not quite dawn, but the kind of pale gray that feels like the world exhaling. I made tea I didn't drink. I stared at the letter until the words blurred, and then I began to write. Not a response, not a diary entry, just something, a letter of my own. To the woman I might have been if someone had told me the truth. That's how it started. And then the words came fast. Not graceful, not poetic, but raw and pulsing. I wrote about the weight of not knowing, about the ache of inventing yourself in the absence of answers, about the rage and the grief and the terrible relief of finally understanding. I wrote to my grandmother, thanking her, and not forgiving her. I wrote to my mother, not as accusation, but as witness. And I wrote to the sister I never had, telling her she was real to me now, even if only here, on this page. I didn't plan to send it. There was nowhere for it to go. But I folded it carefully and slipped it into the envelope that had held hers. The box still sat open beside me, its contents spread across the table like relics. I tucked my letter inside, right where hers had been. One letter sent, one returned, both unsent. Maybe that's how these stories live. Not through confrontation, but through recognition. through the quiet act of saying, I see it now. I see what you tried to hide, and I choose not to keep it anymore. When I looked up, the first hint of sunlight touched the window, and for the first time in days, the house didn't feel haunted. It just felt emptied. I left just before noon. I didn't pack much, just a small bag, the photo I had found, and the letter. Not hers. Mine. I walked slowly through the house one last time, room by room, letting the silence settle. I touched the edge of her teacup, the fabric of her winter coat, the frame of the photo where her eyes stared past the camera, always somewhere else. I didn't feel anger anymore, or grief, just something quieter, a kind of sorrow that no longer asked to be seen. I paused by the hallway where I used to sit as a child, waiting for someone to come home. The shadows there hadn't changed. They just weren't as frightening now, maybe because I understood what cast them. I stepped outside and closed the door gently behind me. No key. I left it on the table beside the folded letter. Whoever came next could decide what to do with it all. The street was quiet, damp from the rain. A bird hopped across the path, then flew away. I stood on the porch a moment longer, looking back at the windows, at the curtains she used to draw at sunset. And I thought, this is where it ends. Not the pain. That lingers. Not the questions. Some will never be answered. But the silence ends here. With me. I walked down the steps and didn't look back again. Some houses you leave behind. Others you carry with you. In the shape of your silence, in the weight of your knowing, in the letter you never send. But always remember.